narrow and winding, and Seabury wasn't signposted from the main road at all. This tended to keep out the majority of tourists, who found their way to the larger resort towns further along the coast instead. Of course, there was always talk about improvements, making Seabury better. Plans to bring in more visitors, more business. A few people wanted the town opened up, developed. Kate shuddered. Change of any kind wasn't something she was very good at dealing with. She loved the place just as it was, just as it had always been. Thankfully, most of the locals were of the same mind. It seemed to be an ongoing battle, but it was one worth fighting. Luckily, a recent plan to develop the surrounding area and widen the access road had been put paid to by the discovery of some particularly rare wildlife, endangered moths or something like that. Kate wasn't really sure if they were real or not. She'd yet to meet anyone who'd actually seen one of these mythical beasts. Still, fictitious or not, they'd been the perfect excuse to kick the developers' plans into the long grass. Now all she had to put up with was the strange dietary requirements of the visiting ecologists who turned up to study the moths. That was a small price to pay to keep Seabury just the way it should be. Kate took another deep lungful of sea air and closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the gulls as they swooped overhead. She'd lived in Seabury all her life. Well, almost all her life. There had been that 3-month blip where she'd moved to London to be with Tom, but the less time she spent thinking about him, the better. They'd been together for less than a year, but he'd now managed to be a thorn in her side for way longer than that. London definitely hadn't been for her. Neither had marriage, come to that. 3 months in, and Kate had given it up for a bad job and returned to Seabury, the only place that she ever wanted to call home again. She dropped straight back into her life here, took the boarding down from the cafe windows, fired up her cranky old Italian coffee machine, and did her best to pretend that the interruption had never happened. Whatever. Today was shaping up to be a perfectly lovely day, and she wasn't going to ruin it by thinking about all that crap, and Tom, and everything she'd almost given up for him. Nope. Nuh-uh. She couldn't believe she'd even considered leaving everything she had here. If Seabury was home, then the locals were her family. The only family she had left these days, other than Stanley. She hadn't been back long before he'd appeared in her life, looking for love and a new home. Suddenly, she had the best friend a girl could ever ask for. A best friend that, right now, was nudging her in the ribs with his nose. All right, let's get back to work, she chuckled, hauling herself to her feet. Stanley followed suit, wafting his feathery tail back and forth, ready to follow her wherever she went next. Kate turned and laid a palm against the stone wall of the old lighthouse for a brief moment. "See you soon," she whispered. The lighthouse was derelict, having been decommissioned years ago. As far as she knew, no one else ever bothered to come out here. But in Kate's eyes, it was the most beautiful, magical place in the entire world. It held some of her most precious memories. Her dad used to bring her up here to play when she was little, and she'd spent many an hour as a teenager with her back propped against the wall, a book abandoned in her lap as she stared out to sea. It belonged to the town council now, and Kate lived with a kind of constant, low-lying dread that they'd do something ridiculous like tear it down or sell it to some developer. But for now, it sat here on the point, mostly forgotten, standing sentry over Seabury. Kate jumped as a wet nose nudged at her free hand, and she looked down at Stanley, who was staring at her with his eyebrows raised. He really did have the best eyebrows in the world, and they tended to go into overdrive when he was hungry. "Okay, boy, you're right," she laughed. "We'd better go and make sure Ethel hasn't been overrun. Race you." She patted her thigh, then hurtled back over towards Trixie. Turning to look for Stanley, she let out a laugh. He was ambling towards her, taking his own sweet time. Before he'd come to live with her,